We are live.
We continue to witness acts of police brutality, decades, centuries old, and now we have police who continue to conduct themselves with impunity even whilst under a microscope. We continue to witness the failure of our justice system when it comes to victims of color. We are also witnessing a public uprising, the result of ongoing work of activists coupled with anger, frustration from communities. It's brought us to a point where the public is angry. They are imagining a future with safer, healthier, happier communities without killer cops. Defund, disarm, dismantle, abolish the police. Welcome to tonight's webcast, Police Brutality, the Spark for Revolt. My name is Nabila, and I'm a member of Socialist Action in Peel Region, and I'll be your host for tonight. I'll be joined by the following speakers. Anne Montagu from Socialist Action USA in the state of Oregon, Peter DeGama, a member of SA North Etobicoke, SA member Sandra Griffin-Bonaparte in Ottawa, and OPSU activist Butterfly Gopal. The format. Our guests will have around 10 minutes each to speak, after which we will then go to questions from the audience. Audience members, you can submit your questions by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing in your questions on the chat column. We encourage all questions and our presenters will do their best to answer them. If you like the webcast, please subscribe to Socialist Action's YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up on our website at www.socialistaction.ca or by calling 647-986-1917. So let's begin. Anne, all the way from the West Coast state of Oregon, welcome. You are a union activist and a member of SA USA's national leadership. What can you tell us about the militarization of police in the US and about the cop-free zone in Seattle?
Well, yes. Thanks a lot for inviting me. And before the mid-1800s, there was nothing like a police force in the North and in the West. If you've ever seen a U.S. Western, you know. And if you haven't watched one, I don't blame you. But basically, there was a sheriff and a deputy. And they were elected by the community. And if they needed more, then they'd have a posse. But there's no police force until the mid-1800s as class conflict arose, including strikes. Then was the first time for the police forces. In the South, of course, they had slave patrols, and that was basically their enforcement mechanism. I think that what's happening now is an increased militarization of the police. So after 9/11, when the attack on Twin Towers, they were doing a lot, taking advantage of being able to restrict rights of citizens. And the Democrats and Republicans decided it would be a great idea to have special grants to give military equipment to cities around the country and the city police forces. And I saw what this was like. I'm in a relatively small town, and there had been a robbery that it was botched, and they were looking for whoever it was. And all of a sudden, there was like a tank on the streets of Salem, and people were just like, "What is this?" And they finally had to respond, and they said, "Well, we have all this equipment. We thought this was a good time to actually use it." So it was pretty shocking to see that not only is there militarization of the police in cities, but it's happening all over the country. And now certainly they're using a lot of that equipment. In Seattle, I think a lot of people are interested in what's happening. In Seattle, there's a section of Seattle called Capitol Hill. And it's not downtown. But prior to there being what was called an autonomous zone, there were demonstrations like there are around every city. And that was by very aggressive. The police is very aggressive in Seattle. They've been under some, they're supposed to be looking for the last 8 years about the violence within the police department. So a lot of this was happening. What was happening was people were starting to kind of converge up on Capitol Hill, which is a different section and not downtown. And they were developing demands, the main demand being major to defund the police, 50% of the money going into the community. The people that were there, kind of the composition, and it was called CHAZ, which was Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And they were, they're pretty much, the composition was Black Lives Matter and social justice activists, also residents. This is a very residential community where people live, and they were very involved in the zone. And people who were houseless, and there was a tent city set up. There were anarchists, and there were some people who were probably just opportunists of being in a large group. So what happened was that they were converging on the East Police Precinct, and there was continual protest. There was tear gas, which was going into all the apartments and the housing in the area, choking people. And so it just got more and more militant. And then all of a sudden, the police station was abandoned. And this is kind of a mystery because the Seattle police chief said she did not order the police to leave. And in fact, there was an email telling the officers not to leave. And but the officers started getting texts to say, head to downtown to the West Precinct. And as soon as they left, then it was declared a no-cop zone by the people there. And the mayor started by saying that people have a right to protest and calling it a free speech zone. She also said public employees, meaning police, have to be flexible and they don't need a singular place of employment. So that was kind of a rationale. So basically they occupied 6 blocks on Capitol Hill, and they were very, very active. The decision making is something that, we're kind of interested in. How are decisions being made? Are they having, mass meetings, making decisions? And I can't get a lot of information. They definitely were having, making decisions in the meetings. I think they were not really well organized, but they were kind of at noon and people knew, and they would just kind of come over and they'd decide. So the demands ended up being not only defunding the police 50%, investing in the community, but that dropping all charges against anyone who was involved in protests, taxing Amazon, and stopping gentrification. And this is important because Amazon actually is on Capitol Hill, not that part of Capitol Hill, but as a result of them being there, the gentrification is just off the charts because of the rents were just going sky high. And so, and the other thing was to fund affordable housing, which is very much needed in Seattle. So they set up their own community. They set up a medical clinic, and the medics that were there, probably from the hospitals, because there are a lot of hospitals on Capitol Hill, volunteering. They'd have speakers, and they weren't isolated. They would go and march in the marches that were happening all over Seattle, and they'd march in a group as being from the autonomous zone. And there were other local organizations. Finally, churches were joining them, pacifist groups, a lot of art, because that's a very artsy area. And it was interesting that when they left the precinct, the police, it was left unlocked. And the people didn't seem to actually go in there. They just hung a banner. And then a couple of days later, 2 police came in and they just locked it up and erected a fence and then left. All city services except for the police can access the area. So fire department, parks, transportation, public transportation, everyone has access to the area. The problem, it's been a couple of weeks now, and the problem is that last week there was a shooting, and one of the victims who was not killed said that racial epithets were spoken before the attack, and so they don't know what group it was. If it was Proud Boys, what kind of a white supremacist group it was, but it was some group. There's a big thing. On television, the police said that they could have tear gassed the protesters and gotten through and saved his life. But then the medics explained to the press that they had set up a prearranged place that was agreed to by the fire department to bring anyone who needed hospitalization. They had a whole system set up, and that's what they did. And the fire department said, yes, that's what they did. They brought the person to them. They got them to the hospital. And then even the mayor agreed that had taken place. As of this last week, there are talks taking place about kind of winding down, maybe. So the mayor wants to remove concrete barriers that define the area. The occupiers are demanding housing, mental health services for those in the encampment. The mayor said there are no plans for the police to return. So today it was reported that a couple of protesters stopped the plans to remove the barriers by engaging in a sit-in in front of the trucks and machinery and the houseless encampment. And the city workers backed off. I think all these workers are union workers in Seattle, and so they just left. So at this point, there's no timeline for evictions or returning of the police. So I think they're going to just continue what they're doing. I think what this does is illustrates the depth and staying power of the movement, the anger and frustration with capitalism's attack on the working class, especially Black and brown workers, and that everything is possible, including living in a space with no cops.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Next, Peter, welcome to the show. You were the Socialist Action candidate in Ward 1 for Toronto City Council in 2018. You're active on both housing and policing issues, and you work with the tenants' rights group Acorn. What can you tell us about the history and the role of cops in the Canadian state?
Thank you, Nabila. I'd like to begin with a quote from Engels when he describes the police. First line of the bodies of armed men. Police, he says, are the first line of the bodies of armed men that are intended to defend the interests of the ruling class. Unlike the worker whose interest is to get rid of the boss's rule, the existence of police is directly tied to the maintenance of state and capitalist relations. And that is what's been the role of police in Canada, in the settler state. In the intro, you mentioned that there's been spark of change spawned by George Floyd's killing, and also the spark of change ignited here in Canada by acts of police brutality. Killings of DeAndre Campbell, Rodney Levy, Chantel Moore, and the death of Regis Arquette, and the very recent killing of Gus Children, have shown that Canada has its own history of racism and police brutality. And the institution of policing in Canada has been to be a John Down for colonial capitalist interests. And this was already formed when Canada gained its independence. Conor MacDonald borrowed the idea of the RCMP from the Royal Irish Constabulary, the paramilitary force created by the British to keep the Irish under control. Conor MacDonald's colonial project was to clear the plains, clear the prairies of Indigenous people, and to displace them and put them onto reserves, whether they were willing. and not. I mean, this has been the persistent role of the Canadian government, the state, and the systemic racism that we face is in the policing is to a large extent in the RCMP. The RCMP was founded in 1873, then known as the Northwest Mounted Police. It was created to advance the agenda of the newly created Dominion of Canada. It was created to stop any opposition to the vision for a separate colonial state. Particularly the RCMP, the Northwest Mounted Police role was to keep order in the Northwest, control the Aboriginal and Métis populations, and to facilitate the transfer of Indigenous territory to the federal government. This was the Tuptup land, basically a Tuptup land from the Aboriginal people, the Indigenous people in Canada. So, and one of the most pernicious things was once they were put onto reserves, tracts of land designated for them by the Canadian state, the state then made sure they didn't leave unless they got permission. And the so-called pass system, which governed relations, the federal government's relation with Indigenous Canadians from 1885 to 1940s, gave power to an Indian agent, so-called Indian agent, to decide whether First Nation person to leave the reserve. This was embodied in the law and enforced by the police, the Northwest Mounted Police, the RCMP. The recently completed national inquiry report of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Women highlights testimonies from those who lived during the era of the pass system. One commentary I'll quote from this, it said, one Indigenous woman said, you're never allowed to leave the reserve, never allowed to shop in the same stores, never allowed to do anything. My grandmother said that was a reality of the whole life growing up. And the report also talks about the Métis people and the sufferings. They suffered under this Canadian state and the RCMP. And they suffered brutally under the Mounties, who frequently paraded through native settlements, intimidate people, and remind them, telling them to stay in their place. This role that the RCMP has inherited has continued to play as enforcer, has continued to this day. They continue to enforce the Indian Act for the federal government. The RCMP has ripped Indigenous children from their parents' arms, forcibly took them to attend residential schools. And presently, they regularly enforce the Crown guaranteed injunctions obtained by corporations to trample Indigenous rights, like we recently saw Wet'suwet'en First Nations removed from their homelands to make way for a pipeline. So we see that this federal colonial role at first was to pave the way for the Canadian government taking away Indigenous land. The second major role was to control labor relations in favor of capital. From 1881 to 1884, 17 Chinese laborers came to work in the Canadian Pacific Railways, and many died during that construction. Once this was done, a head tax was imposed on them that was only removed till 1947. And the other major role was to suppress labor rights. And we saw this during the turn of the century in the 1900s. Then Canada began to accept more immigrants, European immigrants from East Europe, to work in the factories and so forth. But after the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the end of the First World War, and labor relations began to take a more radical turn. The workers in Winnipeg went on strike in May 1919. Business groups formed a coalition committee to mobilize opposition to the strike. And this committee formed their own police force. And I just want to mention one thing in particular. During this period, the police in Winnipeg were fired because they didn't agree to a no pledge. They didn't agree to be the enforcer against workers during this time. So they were fired, and the RCMP was brought in, and also paramilitia owned by the Citizens Committee, which was not really a citizen committee, it was a group of local businesses, the richest business in Canada. And so when they arrested leaders, there was demonstrations against. Okay, so I'll try to wrap up. I'll come back to some of the more other labor relations. So I just want to stress that the role of the police was tied in to first repression of Indigenous rights, and also that of labor. And later on, it criminalized Black and people of color. I'll come back to that. Some of the questions that might follow later.
Thanks, Peter. Sandra, welcome. You're a relatively new member of Socialist Action and a long-time student activist in the Public Service Alliance of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
As a resident of Ottawa, you're familiar with cases there involving police violence and murder. What can you tell us?
Okay. Could you see me at all?
Yeah.
Okay. So, my name is Sandra Griffith Bonaparte, and I'm from the island of Grenada. In 1979, I'll just make my screen a little so you can see some of me here. I don't think you can. Could you?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, I'm good. Okay, in 1979, the New Deal movement overthrew the Grenada government, GLP government, because they were angry and tired of the police brutality, among other things. Coming nearer to home, the reprehensible slaying of George Floyd, a Black American in Minneapolis on May 25th, 2020, sparked global condemnation and massive global protests. This also ignited the call for justice for George Floyd and also for the defunding and dismantling of the police force. Tonight, my presentation will focus on the police brutality locally in the city of Ottawa. You know, many people tend to think that the police in Canada, and specifically in the National Capital Region, is quite different from American police in that they are not as racist and not as brutal as American police. But tonight I want to submit to you that they are as brutal and even more racist than American police, or maybe the same. So I look at some incidents, some cases in July 24th, 2016, following an incident at a local coffee shop. Abdirahman Abdi, a Somalian-Canadian man, was pursued by two police officers and intercepted outside his apartment building. According to the eyewitness account, recounts in Ottawa Citizen, Abdi was pepper sprayed, beaten with a baton, and punched as officers arrest him. Some pleaded with officers to stop and to try to alert them that Abdi was mentally ill, but that didn't help. At the time of Abdi's beating, Monsignor was wearing a so-called assault glove designed with thick carbon layer to mimic the effects of brass knuckles. So you could just imagine that. And Abdi was taken to hospital. Once he got there, he was pronounced dead. A case that's close to me, in 1988, a guy by the name of Earl Edwards, he was a Jamaican immigrant and a choir master in my church. He was shot from behind and wounded in the hand during a traffic stop on Hunt Club Road. You see, Earl's son was in hospital and they called him, and so he and his wife were going, and so they were intercepted by the police. Earl and his wife, Ina, was stopped by the OPP constable, Arno Giek. Earl was shot while seated in his car, and Ina was detained at the back of the police cruiser. Another case that I knew of is in 1991, a guy by the name of Vince Gardner, a Jamaican immigrant. He was shot and killed by Constable John Manette. Gardner was admitted to Ottawa Civic Hospital, where he underwent 3 operations, but he died in hospital without leaving November 16th. You see, the shooting occurred during a botched drug raid, and these guys were just there practicing their guitar, practicing. They had a band, so they went to certain nights of a week to practice, and it happened at a private residence on Gold Street. And after a series of escalating racist attacks by neighbors on the home occupants, including having trash dumped in the yard and car headlights smashed, Constable Manette claimed he mistook a guitar for a firearm and was cleared of all charges, including manslaughter. Imagine that. Another black man, Wayne Johnson, died after being pepper sprayed and chased by the police to the Rideau River. He fell in and drowned. According to reports, police failed to assist him. Police were unable to find Johnson's body. It was found 5 days later by friends of Johnson, just 3 meters from where he was last seen. And so we have many incidents. Like, I'll give you another couple. Terry Norris, an Indigenous man, was pepper sprayed by police during an altercation at a gas station. He died shortly thereafter. On November 25th, 2000, while handcuffed, Julie Kaye had her head repeatedly slammed against the hood of a police squad car by Constable Martin Cardinal. The incident was caught on film, and after lengthy court proceeding, Cardinal eventually pleaded guilty. And guess what? He was sentenced to 75 days community services and also lost 8 days of pay. And that's a shame. But I want to give you another incident that happened, and it happened to a girl by the name of, I think, Stacy Bond. She was picked up by police, and she was like stripped of her clothes, naked in the cell, and beaten, and nothing happened. On August 13, 2011, witnesses say they saw police trip and push a guy by the name of Hugh Saris, a homeless man, into the pavement on Sandy Hill, that's downtown Ottawa, causing a pool of blood to form. Constable Colin Bowie and Tan Tran were eventually acquitted of all charges. People are calling for the defunding and the dismantling of the police. Thousands have signed petitions in other parts of the country, from Vancouver and Regina to Sault Ste. Marie, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, for similar reallocation of police funding. It's time to defund the police budget and to rebalance our use of public funds towards ensuring that our communities are supported in a way that avoid having to have the police show up to the doors in the first place. And that was said by a city councillor, Matt Lowe. The push to defund is gaining momentum in some parts of Canada. In Toronto, where almost a quarter of each person's property taxes go just to fund the police. And so the 2 city councillors talked about it. It is time that we stand up together with the others who are asking that we dismantle the police force and defund them. And I'm done.
Thanks, Sarah. all, welcome. I understand that you work in the Jane and Finch area of Northwest Toronto and that you belong to the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. Please tell us about your experience dealing with systemic racism and the cops.
Thank you so much for including me in today's conversation. And really thanks to Sandra and Peter to kind of lay out that context as well. So my name's Butterfly. I don't belong to OPSU. I'm a member of OPSU. I pay union dues, but OPSU does not represent me as a racialized woman, even as a union member. I'm also, I don't just work in the neighborhood. I'm a resident of Jane and Finch, a proud resident of Jane and Finch. I've been here my entire life. I have a 24-year-old son and a 8-year-old, both Black boys living in the neighborhood. And so maybe I can talk a little bit into the context that I'm in. So social housing, I was also born into Regent Park, downtown social housing, and the development for the suburbs of social housing was a very intentional way to move racialized immigrant faces from the downtown core into the suburbs. Doing that, there wasn't, adequate planning to do this. So we've seen over, this neighborhood used to be, and Jane and Finch is very similar to my neighbor in Rexdale, my friend Peter. We've been organizing for many years as well. These two communities face very similar structural, socio and economic issues. So I'm going to go all over the place. I think anti-policing, police brutality is no, it's part of the history in our neighborhood. Back in the 70s, early 80s, National Film Board did a documentary called Home Feeling, and it really looked at the relationships between police and residents in social housing, in particular, folks from the Caribbean, and in particular, Black bodies. So I think this relationship around policing, it has been historic in Jane and Finch. I think, we've seen the first wave with Mike Harris, with those brutal cuts in the mid-90s. Jane and Finch is a neighborhood over 120 different nationalities, over 60 different languages and dialects. We're a community of not just intergenerational racialized folks, but also refuge for newcomers and refugees to connect to our neighborhood. And in addition to that, also home to folks that have precarious status. So whether it's folks that have been here and have been lost in the system of immigration once our visas were pulled, or folks trying to flee violence and poverty and climate disaster that are being imposed by our countries into countries like ours. So we have a very mixed realities that folks are living with in this neighborhood. And we see also, in the 70s, this neighborhood used to be a very vibrant working class neighborhood, a blue collar neighborhood. And what we're seeing is being highlighted in Hachomsky's report, The Three Cities, where you're seeing these polar divides happening in the city of Toronto, where there's this racial and economic divide. And poorer people are living in suburbs or communities like Jane and Finch, Rexdale, and parts of Scarborough. So I think the 90s really did set the pressure. I've been on my own since I was 14. So when Mike Harris came into my life, I was also a new mom, and really struggling to make ends meet. And that was a huge cut that Mike Harris did across the board with folks on OW and ODSP, and really that group of people have never recovered from that. Continue to really feel the impacts, and really in dire situations that were in COVID. So we also saw divestment in very obvious neoliberal austerity cuts and attacks. When you see that, you know, our school budget was in a deficit of like 80 million, and instead of putting it into school, they built the super jail. And this was the time when crime was down. So neighborhoods like Jane and Finch, you know, feel the impacts in very different ways than communities that are more affluent. We have a community that, you know, English is a second language, different literacy levels, that all contribute to what it is in our neighborhood. So in terms of policing, you know, this neighborhood's no stranger in being tested or being rolled out on. So we've seen it in TAVIS, the Toronto Anti-Violence Intervention Strategy, where this was really an iron fist impacting our communities. Brutal force, rolling up on neighborhoods with children and young people, terrorizing folks, and then being packaged as a way of building relationships with the community, or beautification projects. We felt the impacts of carding, you know, disproportionately being, you were seeing, you know, from pushing to collect data, we're seeing that these were the bodies that were being targeted in carding, and it was bodies and geography. So folks from Jane and Finch and Rexdale were heavily impacted, and that has a ripple effect with school employment. We also see a young boy dying in his high school. And a report rolling out, the Roots to Youth Violence, that has all these great recommendations, and nowhere does it say to have cops in schools, but that was the intervention. We also see the implications with the rollout of the Agent of Landlord, and that was the provincial act to allow police to access public spaces like libraries, community centers, and places that I live, like Toronto community housing sites. And these were all very sophisticated strategies in gathering intelligence on our young people and community, through cops in schools, TAVIS, and these other ways of policing and surveillancing our neighborhood. I think we need to recognize the work in terms of white supremacy and make these connections in terms of there is police brutality, but also the impacts of how people are pushed out of systems and also dying in this way. So, for example, when we were going to have cops in schools, our community organized and did a lot of interviews with community to see, you know, where do people or how do people feel about cops in schools? Do we see a place of cops in schools? And community was really against it and organized and pushed for community consultations, and cops still still ended up in school even with community resistance, right? And Jane and Finch, was the first neighborhood to really push against the resistance of this, and that took 10 years for us to get cops in schools. But what's hopeful is there are relationships that are being built with. So I was introduced as an OPSU member or I belong to OPSU, but I'm a resident member of Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty. And we've been around for over 12 years, really pushing and holding different institutions accountable, and in particular, the police and 31 Division. Sadly, after Jordan died and cops was the response to a young boy dying in school, and not addressing poverty, and not addressing push out rates of our schools, or not addressing child welfare in families' lives from very early on, and being criminalized because people are poor or underhoused. There was also Junior Manon in 2010 who died by the hands of police, and was held to the ground, very similar to Floyd. So these are experiences are very very violent and very real to folks in Jane and Finch, and it's been consistent. Most recently, right before school, there was the young boy who was hogtied by the police and filmed, and the police had no shame to continue to put that public display of brutality of a young boy. Please make note that he was on his way to high school. That same summer, an elder in our neighborhood was surrounded by his home by military. Like, they were cops, militarized cops with big assault weapons, and he was surrounded. And he's an elder in our neighborhood, and he shared the fear he felt when they told him to turn, and how every millisecond he thought he could have died. Right? So this is, or years ago when Tavis and Carding, and the full access, the Toronto police has in our communities and homes, to come into our buildings and, harass young people who are just outside of their apartment doors, asking for their ID and questioning, who they are, and escorting them home. So this is, or raids that have happened where, to get rid of, little children, they zip tie their hands and throw them at the back of the cruisers, and push down Hoyos, out of their way, right? I'm not trying to brush over this. I'm trying to say that there's a history and a community that has been speaking and yelling and screaming and talking about the intersectionalities of policing, healthcare, child welfare, schools, and still communities like Jane and Finch are so. But I think also neighborhoods like Jane and Finch are also pushing. And, there are young people, people who've been on the front line, that have been creating art and music and theater. And, there was a piece that was done, Known to Police, that really talked about the nuances of being known to police. I think in this movement that we're seeing a lot of fire around over the last 5 years has been around, mental health and asking for help and dying. But I live in a community that's everyday reality. I also feel there is a part of the community that's not being. We need to talk also about the gun violence, and I've been seeing, Black Lives Matter and All Black Lives Matter. It's interesting to see how these movements are developing in response to what's happening, but I'm also trying to piece it together. Because I feel when we talk about police brutality, policing, we're also kind of not talking about the Black bodies that are dying by gun violence and horizontal violence. Anyways, so we're gonna get into it. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm sorry if I was all over the place. It's just a really interesting time, and it's also a very yeah. I'll just stop. Yes, thank you. Sorry about that.
No, thanks, Butterfly. I think that your talk really demonstrated how police and public safety is so different according to the neighborhoods you're from. What one community might feel about the police in regards to safety is so polar to what another community might experience in regards to police and safety. Thank you, all of the panelists. I'm gonna pass it along to Kurt Young, who's our technical producer. Kurt, let's go ahead and hear some questions from the online audience.
Okay, so we have, I'm going to start by mentioning two comments that were posted in the chat. One was from Emily Janet, in which she said the Halifax recently came under fire for purchasing armored vehicles, in which was responded by Sarah Claudette, who said, earlier this month, Halifax canceled the contract for armored vehicles. Public pressure was on fire, so it shows that public pressure does have some merit and will gain some victories. Barry Wiseletter asked, today, over 1,000 people gathered at Toronto City Hall on Pride Day at the call of No Pride in Policing Coalition to demand abolition of the cops. Can you describe how LGBTQI folks are victims of cop violence, as are Black, Latino, and Indigenous people? Is police reform an oxymoron? And then we have a second question from me. I did post it in the chat for all those who would like to know. In 1919, both Winnipeg and Seattle experienced a general strike, where tens of thousands of workers occupied and governed their respective cities. What lesson did we learn from this experience, and how can we replicate such a movement across North America? Those are our two questions.
Okay, so let's go in order from the speakers. So we've got Anne, Peter, and we've got Sandra and Butterfly. So if you guys want to answer, the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, I can talk about Pride. It's exciting that you had that many people out today. I think a lot of our Pride activities are being canceled, but many people are going out regardless. Yeah, I think particularly those, Black lesbians and gay men and transgender individuals in our community are people that we are trying to show such solidarity for right now, and integrating. I know I'm in SEIU, and we have a Lavender Caucus, and we are integrating support for Black Lives Matter with all of the work that we do. And I think that's just an important part of who we are. So that's it.
Okay, so in my turn, yeah. So I was at that rally today, and this is what it said. It said, defund and abolish all police. And with regards to Pride, one of the speakers mentioned that the defense of police is, the police are there to protect us. But this speaker made a very good point. The police only protect those who are valued in society. They protect the interests of capital, but even beyond that, for example, they did not protect murdered and Indigenous women. Many Indigenous women were killed even when police knew about what was happening. They took their time. They did not protect. The investigations were not conducted properly. And the same thing with the serial murders in Toronto. gay men. So police did not protect them. And the gay community brought these concerns about that there was a serial murder killing gay people. They did not initiate any action until because till very late. And so, how do we move forward with this movement? I think this has been a very positive time, I think, for us in the movement. John Clark said that this George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter is one area for mobilization. And I've seen this in rallies. We've been essays participated in rallies in Mississauga, and where we've seen a lot of young people come out, a lot of people who was first time in the demonstration. We need to reach out to these movements, and we've been doing essays has been doing this, and we need to reach out more and talk more about how the fight against racial racialized policing is also a fight against capitalism. If we abolish racism, we also need to abolish capitalism. This point has been made by for example, by a Métis activist who, a few years ago, and he said, the more I think about it, in order to fight for Indigenous rights, we have to get rid of capitalism. Indigenous oppression is tied in with the capitalist development of Canada. Thanks.
Hello? I was kicked off. So I'll just say a sentence. Police are there to protect everybody. They're there to protect and serve, and that should be their goal, and that should be their motto. So they shouldn't be picking and choosing who they should protect and who they should brutalize, but it should be for everybody.
For me lately, I've been thinking about organization. I've been thinking about community, and I've been thinking about self-defense. And you know, when we say defund the police, and people hear that, they want to know, well, what's going to be in place? Like, what do you mean defund the police? And I think about, so I'm also a community health worker in this neighborhood, and I'm always floored by the creativity our community has in surviving, and creating systems that work for themselves, right? So our neighborhood, you know, we have, you know, a couple of years ago when JFAP did this research around temp agencies, we saw that there was over 200 temp agencies in our neighborhood, and right away, you know, it's exploiting, it's, you know, exploitive of people's labor. These work conditions aren't safe, but people have no choice, and they work at these places, you know, and the cost of living is so high, and you know, how are people surviving? And you know, families come together, they cook bigger meals, they travel together to work. You know, there's ways that they create childcare for themselves. There's and I work with women who you know, are living with precarious status, as well in very unsafe relationships of domestic, and have children. And you know, can these women call 911 if they're safe, right? And there are ways that, you know, women come together and figure out how to support each other and come up with safety plans and survive without calling 911. And I'm not saying, all I'm saying is there are folks that would never call 911. never, right? And I think the history of trauma and police brutality and surveillancing and the criminality of being poor and just existing in a neighborhood, these are some of like where I am right now in like my thinking. And for me, I wouldn't call the police. I know that my safety is on the line for the work I do, and my children's safety is also on the line. So there are communities that are operating without police, and there has been a lot of priority on police and their budgets, and not in health, and not in education, and not in housing, and not in labor. So yeah, defund the police. Let's burn it down.
Kurt, do we have any more questions?
Yes, we do. So our next question is from Elizabeth Bice. She says, some people are asking why there are calls to defund the police in Canada. They say this country is different than the United States. How do the panelists feel about that, regarding that statement? And from Gruha, Guelph Renters Union and Housing Advocate asks, how can leftist grassroots organizations discredit the police while also raising class consciousness? What is the best messaging for connecting police officers to capitalism or to capitalists?
Yeah, I think I'll answer the second question, and connecting class consciousness to the police. Right now, I'm working with the rank and file group in SEIU for No Cops in our union, which is education about the role of police unions not being unions, and why we don't want them in our union. And so that's an important thing about, and I don't know what your situation is in Canada, but the police unions are really a major part of the problem. And I think it's important for other unions to address these issues. And there is a lot of education to be done, but I think and we're in an environment right now where we can, and we just, as union members, need to show up and talk about the role of police, and why we are against having police unions in our union or in any part of our country. It's education, of course. Yeah. Thanks.
Kurt, can you just repeat that first question? I didn't get that. Just briefly.
So Elizabeth Bice asks, some people are asking why there are calls to defund the police in Canada. They say this country is different than the United States. How do the panelists feel about that?
Yeah, I think Canadian politicians try to say that America is different. America has all these problems. So I don't agree with that idea of Canadian exceptionalism. Like I said, the history of Canada has been of settler colonialism, and we have the same problems in terms of slavery. Canada had slavery for 200 years, from 1600s to about 1834. In this country, it wasn't abolished until 1834, and we had laws that protected slave owners, both in the French Civil Code and the English Code. So we're not exceptional compared to America, and that's the point that I would make. And in terms of, for example, I was going to talk about the Nixon's Nixon when he wanted to win the elections. He saw a threat from the Black African Americans and dissidents, peace activists. So they made a bargain with the drug dealers, and they flooded the country with cocaine in order to criminalize the population. And Canada has felt some of that spillover in the 70s and 80s. So in states you had Reagan's crime bill, and then you had Joe Biden crime bill, and then in Canada we had Harper's mandatory minimums. So things that happen in the states happen here, and that's what I characterize that. And the question about how do we, I'd agree with Anne that we need to get, say, police out of unions. And this is the point I think that Anne asked a question previously, but didn't get a chance to answer it properly. Yeah, Winnipeg and Seattle both had general strikes. And the lesson we learned from that is that the police force in Winnipeg at that time didn't act against the strikers. It was the RCMP. The police force acted in solidarity with the strikers, and that was a unique situation. Many of them were immigrants who had come in from Eastern Europe and still identified as working people. Today's police police unions don't see themselves as workers, as representing workers or being part of the working class. They see themselves more as Engel said, the armed bodies to enforce rules in favor of the capitalist class and against the workers. I mean, we can see that. I mean, in 2008 financial crisis, nobody from the banks were arrested. Whereas if people were evicted from their homes, and the people who didn't make that payments had to undergo hardship. And today, if a tenant doesn't pay the rent, they're most likely going to be evicted from their homes. And on the TTC, July 2nd, they're going to put in back fare inspectors on the buses. So if somebody happens to forget to swipe the card or didn't have enough money in their card, I mean, they're going to be bullied by these inspectors. So it is, we criminalize working people, and police unions don't have class solidarity. And we at VAM, if we want to learn from that strike, we have to find how to build unity outside the police unions, how to build unity with workers. Rank and file workers in Winnipeg General Strike had come out to defend their leaders, because their leaders at that time represented their interests, not a bureaucratic interest, but their real interests. And so I think that's the lesson we learn. Trade union leaders need to understand the real interests of their workers and fight for those interests and organize a broad movement and call for a new general strike, and a general strike that calls not only for the abolition of the police, but for the society that makes possible such oppressive police. Thanks.
So we have the same racist police in Canada as in America. We have the same brutality happening across the board. Some people say that racism in Canada is more subtle. I don't see that way. I see that they're brutal, they're racist, and it's not even, it's overt and not covert. The police force here should be structured in such a way that, you know, they don't have the power in their hands. They should be defunded. The money should be whatever the council should take over so that they can redirect the money to the community. They should have the autonomy. Certain responsibilities should not be given to the police so that they can take matters in their own hands. Oh, my microphone is noisy. Are you hearing me? Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, we are.
Okay, hold on a second. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. So you want me to start? Were you hearing me before?
Yes, we were.
Okay. So so we should give the autonomy to the local council so that the money would be redirected to the community so that they could send the right people when people need them. So if you have people with mental illness, you wouldn't send a police officers who don't know how to deal with it, but you send somebody who has the training, and so they know how to de-escalate the situation. And I strongly believe that we should defund the policing system in Canada.
Okay, so I'm a union. I'm OPSU Region 5, and I really push my union. I really push them. My local was a composite of a hospital, so and we're a small community health center. So we were a joke. We were a joke, and so I ran a few years ago for the regionals for the executive board, and so I also ran for school board trustee with a community sister on a slate, and you know, these are big institutions, whether it's school board and counselor or OPSU Region 5 executive. As much as unions are progressive and you know, it's better than the Employment Standard Act, right? There's hierarchies, right? The union's built on white supremacy. Certain workers' voices are heard. Certain workers are more valued in leadership position, and certain workers should stay in their place and do what they do. So I wasn't delusional running. It was a way to push the conversation. It was a way to say people like me can take up space and really connect with our members that typically probably wouldn't engage in the past. So OPSU, we have a huge corrections. And that's, you know, my union brothers and sisters, right? And part of my platform was talking about getting rid of cops out of schools. I didn't hide these things as part of my platform, knowing who's going to be voting me in. And I got slapped up. I think I hung on for maybe the first run, and I got slapped up right out of there. So yeah, there's a lot of work we need to do in our unions, and really people who have the power historically aren't going to give it up that easy. So it can't just be within the unions, it's also pressure from outside, and for unions to build relationships with community. So I sit at a few tables and networks and coalitions in the neighborhood, and I was sitting at the education table, and I was actually doing two meetings, and I overheard the police, just the word police in that conversation, and I had to go into this conversation. And what I found out was a teacher who wasn't able to get a hold of a student somehow engaged with the police. So I don't know if the teacher, now remember, the teacher has a duty to report, and that's to their college. They don't need to go to the administration to ask permission, but they could have. But essentially, the cops were called to do a wellness check. Later on that week, I was at another table, and this table is a crisis support network table. It's a community space of community-based organizations. And at that table, the police were there. I don't know why. And we were talking about a recent raid. And that police was like, oh, well, I need to get there tomorrow to do a wellness check. So institutions are also creating paths for police. So whether it's the schools, whether it's, you know, Toronto Housing, or and then I've also been in spaces with the police years ago where they will, you know, push back on community, say, well, I'm not a social worker. You know, I am a police officer and this is how I do my work. But when I challenged this officer recently, I said to him, that sounds like the work of a social worker. And he says, yeah, it is. But, you know, I got promoted, so I'm doing it. So, yeah, these are just experiences I'm sharing that's happening on the ground. And I think it's important that when we talk about community self-defense, what does that look like when we also talk about defunding the police? So I don't know if I answered that person or asked more questions, but.
Thanks, Butterfly. No, I think you've identified like this huge gap in terms of capacity and who actually has the power to react versus what's actually needed. And my hope is that that gap is quite blatant, and that during the sort of next few weeks, that even the people that hold the power, the politicians, are able to not sort of hide around the bush in terms of these gaps and really address it. And hopefully that is defunding and putting the money in people that have the capacity to have these responses to the community. Kurt, any more questions?
Yes, we have 3 more, and these will be our 3 last questions. So our first question comes from Rob McBean. If 10% of the police budget were to be cut in a city like Toronto, what do you believe would be done with the money saved? The next one is from Barry Weisletter, who says, policing in a worker state would be radically different than in a capitalist state. It would come about as a result of revolution from the bottom up. Would it be like a workers' picket line? And then our final question is from Nabila Irfan herself, our nice host, who asks, the topic of police and its role is something that I am learning about. Do you have any authors, books, or teachers you would recommend we turn to learn more about this topic?
Okay, thanks, Kurt. Let's start off with Anne. Any comments?
I have to say that the first place you could learn is from Butterfly, and I wish she was in my union. I want to say, but I can't talk about Canada in terms of defunding the police, but I can talk about in the U.S. The idea of defunding police is not that the police decides where that percent that is cut will come from. It should come from the community, and Minneapolis is a main place that's dealing with this, and they're actually talking about also disbanding. I know in the United States that 80% of calls that police get have nothing to do with personal safety. And I think that the way that will work eventually has to be empowering the communities. Many, many years ago, we had to demand Black control of the Black community. And I think all of our communities need to be able to control that. I think maybe in Seattle, they were talking about building a community that they could actually control. But this will be a unique demonstration of democracy in action to let communities actually have a vote on who's in their community and how they get safety.
Peter, do you have any answers in regards to the questions?
Yeah. So in terms of resources, defunding, 10% is a very small amount. It won't make a dent. So Black Lives Matter is calling for 50%. But so supposing that 10% could be used to fund people, the institutions that deal with mental health, particularly CAMH, and other crisis intervention teams that are non-police. so we could develop a non-police response to mental health risk and challenge, people who are facing mental health and risk challenge. Beyond that, and but that's not enough to get at other parts of funding that we need. We need 50% because we need to fund housing, and fighting homelessness, fighting for free transit, funding free transit, funding better transit, making transit accessible. And in terms of how would abolishing, how would that look up? And we had, from history, we see the Paris Commune, which was uprising from the ground up. That formed their own police. They got rid of the old police, the old oppressive police, and they formed a community police and the institutions. And Marx said this was creating democracy anew, beating down the oppressive system and creating democracy anew. And something that comes to mind again in this regard, the daughter of George Floyd said, "My daddy changed the world." And I think what that speaks to is people are imagining new ways of doing things. And we can learn from history. We can learn from what happened in the Paris Commune, what happened in also in 1917 Soviet Russian Revolution with the Workers' Council, Workers and Peasants Council, that organized from the ground up to defeat the Tsar state and to end the war and to try to build a socialist society. And I think right now we're experiencing such a possibility, but it's in embryo. It's people are thinking what a society without police would look like. And the more you think what a society with police would look like, the more you would delve into the oppressive nature of the capitalist system, and the more you come to the conclusion that it has to be abolished, and then the more people that undertake this imagining and undertake this education, then I think we can have upswell against the system. And part of our role in socialist action is helping to further this education along the line, so that upswell from the ground up comes about. And we do this in socialist action, also do work in the NDP and workers' action movement, try to bring up this rank and file upswell against the system. Thanks.
Copy. Thanks, Peter. Sandra, do you have any comments in regards to these questions?
And the question on 10% cuts to the police, the way I see it is, it's just a drop in the bucket. It's not a whole lot of money if you cut 10%. However, that 10% could go back into the community to help with social services and money to finance different social programs. And that 10%, the police will have to focus on that, because they'll be doing what they're called to do police work, and not meddling in other things that they shouldn't be meddling in. It would be slimmer in terms of the police force will be doing real policing rather than discriminating and brutalizing people out there. So, as I say, it's not a big, a whole lot of money for the community. That 10% is not a whole big cut to the police, but it could go into helping the community. Certain aspect of the police work, they wouldn't have to do it anymore, but focus on their own work that they should be doing.
Thanks, Sandra. Butterfly, any comments in regards to these questions?
So I totally agree with what everybody is saying, that that's a joke. In the context that we're in, for me in Toronto, Jane and Finch, it's all hands on deck. This, 10%, 50%, like, we are so far behind in our neighborhood. You can't even compare us to like a Rosedale, right? Like, our housing is falling apart. This neighborhood was built in the 70s, and our homes are falling apart. But gentrification's coming, the LRT's coming, the subways are here, and the cost of rent is going up. They're pushing us out of this neighborhood. Jules! We're being pushed out of our neighborhood. This is happening right now. There's no jobs in our neighborhood. This has been happening, a divestment of resources and employment opportunities for decades in our neighborhood. We need dollars to go back into this, to develop jobs, good jobs, jobs that are that are part of this new wave of technology and what's happening. They know the labor trends. These are the investments our neighborhoods need. We need education and school systems that are going to keep us in. Buildings that look like that you want to be taught in there, the teachers that want to teach our kids and not look at us like we're animals, or giving us photocopied textbooks as our learning tools. We've got to, and if we don't start dreaming, we're going to always be stuck on, how about, those really bad criminals? What are we going to do with the bad criminals? But our society is so sick that, mental health is a product of poverty, is a product of homelessness, is a product of hopelessness and helplessness, is a product of being lied to and coming to this country and being forced into manual labor with degrees of being engineers and doctors. Legislation of migrant workers that are, post-slavery legislation. Like, we got to scrap this and start over. And if we get stuck on the 10%, 50%, we need to dream, and we need to scrap what we know is broken, that's been harmful, that's been killing our community, and has been displacing the world. So it's semantics when we talk about percentage. When I'm talking about a global impact of people's lives not mattering, whether it's their labor, whether it's what they contribute, whether it's just to be young and exist in a hallway in their building, it's a problem.
Yeah, and to sort of add on to that, I think one of my fears is, in the midst of the global pandemic, I fear that a response from a lot of governments, whether municipal or provincial, will be austerity measures due to responding to COVID-19 and not being adequately able to respond to our demands. So, I'm curious how the discussions continue and how we sort of hear back from our politicians. Thank you to all the panelists. I want to give you an opportunity for any last words that you guys have. So let's start off from the top. Let's go from Anne, Peter, Sandra, and Butterfly. If you guys have any last words, please go ahead.
Thanks so much for inviting me, and we have to keep up the struggle. And it seems to me that this is the biggest mobilizations that I've seen in my lifetime, and I think it's only getting bigger and stronger until we can actually make real changes in our society for the working class. Thanks.
Thanks for. I'd like to thank you, Nabila, for asking me to be part of this discussion. And I just want to mention the resources. I didn't get to that question, but some good resources are books by Alex Vitale, End of Policing. I think that's free on Verso Books, the download. Policing Black Lives by Robyn Maynard, and Desmond Cole's new book, I think, The Skin Mirror, and so, and also to follow, you can follow online the Toronto Prison Abolition Project. It's also a good source of information. And if you can get down to City Hall, you'll see a big banner, and it says defund the police, and gives the areas where money should be go into. They mention housing, no evictions, uh, uh, transit, mental health, and social programs, putting the money in social programs. So there's a big banner that's unfurled there, and I just want to end. I think we have to imagine, like I said, imagine what kind of society we want. I think we really want. This is a quote from Gerald Smith, an organizer in Oakland, a former Black Panther, and he said this: if you really want to defund the police, we're going to require a transformation of our entire society, from the capitalist society that it is now to a social society that it will soon become. I think that says it right. That's work we have to do, and that's work Social Action is committed to doing in the future.
So the world has come to a new awakening about policing in North America. The world is getting a glimpse of what is happening in North America. We, as SAs, as activists, as unionists, we need to keep on pushing and putting pressure on the different governments to affect change. This change is long overdue. We need to keep hope alive so that we could finally see a better world, maybe a utopia.
So I'm from a neighborhood, you know, that started this work way before me, and I'm just so honored that I live and I'm able to raise my family here and be a part of the history that, you know, our elders, you know, this community's made of people from the Caribbean, Latin America, the continent, and these folks, you know, built this neighborhood and have, you know, I've been saying this whenever I get a chance. They've laid the seeds, you know, and we've been taking care of the seeds, and this is harvesting time, and this is what the revolution can look like, and the opportunity to dream and love and create something that Toronto, Ontario, Canada, North America, the world has never seen. Young people are taking to the streets that I've never seen before, not connected to unions, not connected to student groups, not connected to anti-poverty movements. They are connected to a resistance, to a movement and fire, and I'm excited to be a part of this. And I also, you know, we've talked about transit a few times today. We're also co-hosting a webinar on the 2nd of July. If I could share in the group with folks, that would be awesome. And hope to organize and build with you all.
Sorry, could you give more details on that webinar on July 2nd, please?
Sure. It's in partnership with Free Transit Coalition, in particular Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty and Free Transit. It's called Staying Safe on Transit. And it's the same day, like folks have noted, with the mandatory mask, as well as the rollout of fare inspectors. We have 4 speakers who will speak to staying safe in terms of their location. So Carolina from Decent Health Coalition, Melinda Francis, personal support worker, JFAT member, Susie Noreen as well, who would be talking about gentrification and new development and policing. as well as a friend, Adam, who's from the Disability Working Group of TTC Riders. And oh my goodness, I hope I got everyone, but I can send the link if that's okay with folks.
Perfect. Thanks, Sandra. Just forward that information and perhaps we can add it to our YouTube description. To conclude, I'd like to, give a special thanks to Anne, Peter, Sandra, and Butterfly, to our producer, Kurt, in Mississauga, and to everyone who participated in tonight's conversation. Thank you. Please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action, the newspaper. It's only $25 for a year, delivered to your door. To fill out the form, please visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. Again, that's www.socialistaction.ca. If you'd like to talk to us about joining SA, you can write to us at socialistactioncanada@gmail.com, or you can just call us at 647-986-1917. Again, that's 647-986-1917. Once again, if you've liked this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next Socialist Action webcast will be on Thursday, July the 2nd, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. It's titled The Exploitation and Resistance of Migrant Workers. The host will be Jeremy Corrigan, Vancouver, with guest speakers Gabrielle Aladua and Pauline C. I would also like to plug a town hall being held by the Peel Police for those of you that are from the Peel region. This will be via teleconference on Tuesday, June 30th at 6:30 p.m. You do need to sign up a full day in advance. So if you're interested, please visit www.peelpolice.ca/townhall. Again, that's www.peelpolice.ca/townhall. I think community members really need to be present and really push the police and really question them on what's going on and how to change the system and ensure that defunding does happen. Again, if you need any more details, please visit our website again at www.socialistaction.ca. In the meantime, everybody, please stay safe, healthy, and active. Good evening for now. Cheers.